Okay, I think I'll attempt to recall what we decided we'd talk about last time to start with. So, one of the things we distinguished last time was maybe two broad sets of concerns around transformative AI in the near term. One of them being kind of existential risk type concerns, and another being not unrelated, but perhaps more mundane in some way and maybe easier to think about and lean into in a detailed fashion, which is just impacts on relationships between people, whether those are parent-child relationships, co-worker relationships, employer-employee relationships, relationships between institutions and individuals. So I thought it might be fun to think through if we just take existing systems, and maybe I'll start by saying a little bit about some experiments I've been doing with my son with Dolly to set the tone in a moment. If we could think through some of the kind of scenarios in which more and more capable versions of such tools start to undermine or disrupt those relationships, which after all make up the social fabric, which has to be something on the list of things we're concerned about protecting against potential negative impacts from AI. Obviously, those things could be vibrantly enhanced also by these technologies. So it's not like the only things to think about here are negative. But did you have anything to add to that in terms of agenda, Adam?
Not so much in terms of the agenda. Just for context, and because I realized over the course of thinking through things this week that over the last several weeks I haven't done a good job of explaining why I've come to into this set of conversations in a state of confusion and frankly, panic and or at least very much elevated anxiety. And maybe that background is useful for the conversation if you'll indulge me just very quickly. And I think we have an hour tonight as opposed to 30 minutes, right, Dan?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, then if that's okay, then so they're just super quickly. Up until very recently, um, uh, and I'm not an expert in AI or machine learning or any of this stuff. You guys are the experts. I'm an outside observer with an interest, but a lay person. So up until recently, um, my impression was that the artificial intelligence was going to remain narrow for many decades still, that it was naive or somehow, utopian or fantastical to imagine that um, general intelligence was on the cards, anytime soon. Certainly not in the 2020s or 2030s. Maybe it becomes somewhat plausible in 2040s, but easily out into the second half of this century. And that it was reckless to and again just kind of fantastical and a bit silly to think that general artificial intelligence was something that was on the cards anytime soon. Now going along with that was a presumption that I was making. Maybe others were making it, but I was certainly making it, which was that a lot of the creative, constructive, um, especially I'm thinking of things like art and text composition. I was assuming that those sorts of artificial intelligence capabilities were coupled directly with generality of intelligence. In other words, my assumption was that uh, AI would need to be, we would have to have AGI, we have to have general artificial intelligence before, or at least, fairly close to, um, in time, we would have to be pretty close to having general artificial intelligence as a technology before we could expect things like, neural networks or other models, other systems, other artificially intelligent systems able to do things like paint paintings and compose music and, write more than a few sentences in a coherent way. Certainly, long essays, let alone, my goodness, write books or something like that. And so that was my assumption, was that all of these capabilities, all of these capacities that are, of course, we were seeing with such mind-blowing, stunning effects. Every day I look in the news, there's something new. We've seen this recently. And so this has come as a shock to me, because, of course, I was thinking, okay, we're not going to be able to do anything like that until we have general artificial intelligence, or pretty darn close, and all that's decades away. So what is the AI we're really talking about? I was stuck thinking it was things like, well, it's going to be machines that can, like self-driving cars, or warehouse robots, or farm robots that can do simple things like navigate a physical environment, interact with some of the elements in it in a fairly sophisticated way, not crash into things if you're driving on the road, pick parts out of bins and in a warehouse, tell the difference between a weed and a crop in a field, and pull the weed up, and et cetera, et cetera. Add a 10,000 things to the list of toil and drudgery. I was imagining that those were the things that we would be automating fairly soon. In other words, over the next, say, 10 to 15 years, some horizon that's not so far out that we can't say anything about the future, and that we can apply some sort of existing theoretical and methodological approaches to understanding technology disruptions. And of course, the last several years, and the whole transformer-based models, that entire revolution, all of these things have completely turned that entire thinking, the whole universe of my understanding of artificial intelligence, completely on its head. And these capacities, like what you sent me an amazing image today, Dan, out of DALL-E, not DALL-E 2. I think you're using the original one. It just blows my mind that what's even possible right now. So anyway, I have come into the situation in a state of confusion, because the capacities that are have arrived already and seem to be imminent in their arrival are things that I was honestly not prepared for. I was just not thinking they were on the cards for decades yet. And so that was obviously an enormous error. And well, yeah, I'm not sure where I cut off, but the bottom line is that there are capacities that are emerging even ahead of general intelligence, and perhaps general intelligence is much closer than many of us were expecting, 3-4 years ago. Maybe it's not the 2050s and 2060s. Maybe it's much earlier than that. But at any rate, these new capacities, like what we're seeing out of DALL-E and the GPT models and so forth, these have enormous potential, I think, to disrupt personal relationships, to disrupt our individual and group. Gosh, rats.
Hello again.
Sorry, guys.
We heard you say
I'm
rats.
not sure how to. Oh, rats. Yeah, sorry. I getting an error message that comes up, says the Roblox has run into a fatal error and needs to restart or something like that. And then I said, "Oh, rats," and then it kicked me off. So anyway, you guys, I think, get the point, which is that we have still, I think, narrow artificial intelligence, certainly AI that is not conscious and self-aware, blah blah blah, but that still has the potential to be providing functionality that could be very disruptive to personal relationships, to our individual and collective relationships with institutions like media and our sources of information, our educational institutions like universities, our governments, obviously, and because of that, I think this is a much more pressing issue than I ever could have imagined it would be, much sooner. So that is all as context for last week and this week, and maybe I don't know how many conversations we'll have in this series, but that's sort of the context I'm coming to from. Does that make sense, Dan, in terms of where you were hoping to head with this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, okay, maybe I'll I think a lot of the people who are paying attention to Discord have seen this, but I'll briefly outline some of the things I was doing with my son the other day. So we've been making a card game, right? That's the context for this. And messing around with Dorly. It's Dorly 2, but I guess in their API they just call it Dorly. So Dorly 2 is open to the public. You can apply, and many millions of people now have access. So Dorly is a transformer-based diffusion model. I don't actually know the details of the model very well, but it's a relatively simple algorithm that is trained on text and images scraped from the internet. I'm not exactly clear what the training set is, but the way you use it is you type in some text, maybe 100 to 200 words at most, and then it generates an image, and it's, I think, 1024 by 1024, the image it generates. And it can basically generate an image of almost anything. It won't be perfect, but almost anything you type in, you'll get something that is plausibly a version of that image, which is amazing. But it's also a tool that you can use as a kind of foundational stone for doing more elaborate things. So one thing we've been working on is using Dorly to generate patches of size 1024 by 1024, but then you cut off some part of it and use that to grow another image. So you can provide an input to Dorly as well as the text. You can provide a piece of an image and then ask it to kind of fill in the rest. So you can use that to just grow your image to basically as large as you wish. And so we were doing that and generated an image. Now, the relevant part for this conversation isn't the kind of hey wow factor, although it's pretty cool. It's the role this then played in our activities for the rest of that day, which was we played the card game that he wanted to make, and he was telling stories based off this image, right? So in the card game, it's based on some video game he likes. He took us to Inscription, some of you know it. So he took us to some locations that were based on this image the AI made, and then he was like a boss that was in that location, and he made me play against him and lose. Okay, so this is a role of art in human life that is pretty novel, I think. Right, so this piece of art that the computer made, and I think it's hard to argue it's not art. It's visually attractive, it's novel, it inspired some creativity and imagination and emotion on the part of the humans who interacted with it. And it heightened the kind of human experience of myself and my son interacting with it and doing the other things we were doing. And it took about 30 minutes to make that image because it's a bit of a manual process. But then we played with it for kind of 2 hours. So once that process becomes more and more streamlined, you can imagine that the role of art in the lives of sort of normal people that aren't ultra wealthy, and even the ultra wealthy aren't commissioning paintings on a whim every day, right? So the role of art in human experience is going to change extremely rapidly and radically as a result of these kinds of technologies. And even that on its own is quite a startling thing to think about when you kind of extrapolate its implications. But that's about to happen for music. It's about to happen for also text. Yeah, I see Matt's comment about art. I don't see how that's a sort of coherent position. I mean, I guess I have this argument with Lucas as well, and he's writing a whole book about how music is really just something that people make to communicate their emotions. But there's a bit of a Turing test element to this, right? If I can't tell whether it's a human or machine that made it, but it enhances my life and causes me to think thoughts I wouldn't otherwise think, or experience things, or feel things, it's serving the kind of utility of art as far as I'm concerned. Maybe we would like it to be made by humans, but another aspect of this that's interesting is that it will displace a lot of human artists, this technology. It's already doing it. My wife's a writer and works for a TV show that is currently not employing artists exactly because her friend, the director, is using this technology. So I know very clearly that this is happening. but it's also, like many disruptions that we've discussed earlier in this seminar, it's a case where there are just situations where you would never have employed a human artist, but this will produce art, if you want to call it art, right? Like in a situation like I was doing with my son. We're playing a game on a Sunday morning, and we want to have the AI. We want someone to make a beautiful piece of art for a map so we can play our game on a whim in 30 minutes based on a list of criteria that we've kind of been developing in our heads in this private game we're playing. There's just no way that that's servable at scale by human artists, whether or not you think that would be desirable. So yeah, that's just an example of one of the ways in which a key, part of the human experience, which is our interaction with art, is going to change. So maybe we'll open up the floor to discuss that, but we can move on also to other examples. Yeah, further
I have
thoughts on
a
that?
couple of thoughts on that, if
Go ahead.
that's okay. So a couple of different things, some parallels, and then also just some thoughts about art itself. So, um, art is it's obviously it's a tough topic to analyze. It sort of doesn't lend itself to analysis. It's almost analysis is in some ways antithetical to the concept, as it were. But I think it's reasonably fair to say that art it performs different functions. And it depends. If one of those functions is expression, so if you are the artist, then expressing yourself, communicating yourself, um, uh, uh, making making um, your sort of internal uh, visualization and imagination capacities tangible in the outside physical world is there's utility to that. So if you're composing music and you're the composer, if you're a painter and you paint a painting, then you get something out of that process. That's quite a different function. That's quite a different source of value and utility and meaning than if you are the recipient, if you're the audience, if you're the viewer, if you're the observer who hasn't created the piece of art but is now observing it, reacting to it. And so if you're listening to a piece of music that you didn't compose, it may have, or you were looking at a painting or reading a book or whatever it is, that you didn't create, and it's not a form of your own expression, uh, it may nevertheless have a remarkable impact on you. Certainly, we've all been affected by music that we didn't write, and stories that we didn't write, and paintings that we didn't paint, and so on. But that's a separate, I think, function, and source of value and meaning that art has. And then, of course, you can think of there are economic functions and there are social functions and so forth, um, that these forms of creativity take. And I think it's possible to maybe go through those and see which pieces of that remain if the art is created by something or someone, by something that isn't human, right? And so in that respect, yes, it ceases to be self-expression in the same way if the painting is not painted by a human being, but if the result is a beautiful painting that people react to and get value out of and find meaningful, or same with a symphony or an amazing fusion jazz piece of music or whatever it might be that floats your boat, that's all still that value can remain. And so I think we probably need to look at the multifaceted functions that art and creativity play. That's one thought. A couple of parallels here. One is that we in other technology disruptions in the past that have created abundance. And mainly the way the way that my team usually frames this is that we say a technology drastically reduces the typically it drastically reduces the marginal cost of producing another unit of whatever the product or service is. Technologies have done this many times, and current disruptions are doing this as we speak. So a very good very familiar, very recent example of this is the internet and networked computers and computing more generally have made the marginal cost of communication and copying information, very, very low, virtually zero. Very, very close functionally, nothing. And so this is a very different world than the world prior to the digital revolution, where information was physical, tangible products with a very high marginal cost, and communication was expensive. So that's a familiar example. Another example that's we're sort of in the process of creating is in energy, where and my team has an analysis and some terminology for this phenomenon. But basically, what we're about to enter is a world in which the marginal cost of energy is going to plummet to very close to zero because of a very large installed capacity base of solar and wind power, which themselves have very near zero operating costs, especially solar. And so you get on sunny days, you get a super abundance of energy out of them, and the units of energy have a very, 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 very low marginal cost. And what we've seen, and you can think through with those two examples, is that entirely new ways of relating to energy, relating to information, relating to communications, entirely new ways of building businesses around them, entirely new ways of utilizing them as resources, building systems and institutions around them. Those all change radically when you have a situation of extreme abundance and very, very low marginal cost. And so I think what we're likely to see is something analogous. Again, I was mentioned that this is a parallel, that here we have artificial intelligence able to produce something that, in the past would have taken artists days or weeks or whatever. It would have been very expensive. It just would have been impossible. We were going to have an abundance of that ability to create whatever music, art, to kind of conjure into physical reality the things that we were previously only able to visualize in our minds, and only with very painstaking, very slow and very skill intensive processes pull out of our imagination and make real. We're now going to live in a world where those things are abundant, and it's going to change things, right? And in the same way that the digital revolution changed the world we live in by making it trivial to copy and transmit information, and the clean technology revolution we're currently in the midst of is going to change the world by making energy super abundant, and we're artificial intelligence is going to change the world by making the products of intelligence super abundant and extremely low marginal cost. And so these all run very much parallel to one another, I think.
Yeah, cool. I mean, maybe since we're on this topic, let's just stick with it. So this is, if we start to build up some schema here, there's a relationship between artists and society, and also a relationship between art and society. And we're sort of discussing maybe all three of these. Matt made a comment in the chat. I guess I'll read it out. He can add to that if he wishes. He says that where AI is controllable, directable by a human, it can still be used for expression as a medium, like photography or painting. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I want to push back against that a little bit, and also some of the earlier, like, pro-human comments. Obviously, that's taking place already, right? You have to direct Dorley, so you could say that we created that image, my son and I. We provided the prompt and we steered it. I mean, the way Dorley works, which I think is relevant to this discussion, is that when you type in a prompt, you get 5 images, and they may be quite different. They're like 5 different runs of Dorley trying to realize your image subject to the constraints of it being sort of from the same distribution as the training set. And, you pick one, and, there's some cherry picking involved. Some of them maybe just kind of, sometimes they just blank, or maybe in some of them the faces look completely wrong, or usually they're all pretty good. So I think, it's not like they're mostly garbage and then there's a huge amount of human agency in picking a great one. They're like all good, but maybe there's one particularly great one. So I think when we were generating that image you saw, Adam, of the ants, generally we just picked one of the 5, but you can then re-roll and get more if you're not quite satisfied. So maybe we did that. We made 13 images, so 13 runs of Dorley. Maybe we had 20 runs, so overall maybe 7 additional re-rolls. Okay, so there's some human, obviously it's an artifact of our creativity to some extent, and that will be true in music as well. But I do want to push back against the idea that this is just a tool, like a camera or a brush, and this gets into the role of art in society and the role of artists in society. So I know a few of you have read Jung. I'll just briefly recap Jung's take on the role of art in society, which is he viewed art as kind of like a precursor to science in the sense that it's a way of articulating the unknown at a primitive stage. So there's information out there in the environment that needs to be incorporated into society, into knowledge, but maybe it's difficult to make it explicit. So it's first represented in art, maybe hundreds or thousands of years before it's made explicit. And then there's a process by which it's kind of influences people and is distilled into other forms of art, and then eventually maybe codified in something that can be kind of discussed rationally. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. However, that's not perhaps so you could talk about art as kind of decoration, right? When you put wallpaper in your house, I don't think it's communicating anything deep about reality to you. And maybe, the paintings of oceans I have on my walls, I'm not sure they're really containing a deep truth, although I do like them and they affect me. So it's not like all art is in that mode. But perhaps that's one of the things we're afraid of losing if we just get Dolly to generate images and call that art. I think that's fair. On the other hand, let me push back by trashing humans a bit. So, who says the AI isn't better at that? Dolly is trained perhaps on all of the internet, and GPT-3 has read every novel ever written. What is that if not the collective unconscious, right? You think that sufficiently good AIs can't represent hidden themes in that as well as an artist? I'm not so sure.
Well, certainly in my mind, if the existing AIs can't, just wait 5 or 10 years. I mean, my goodness. If improvement continues, if performance increases are as consistent as they have been for any length of time, the capacities in my mind are likely to become quite incontrovertibly stunning and certainly superhuman. Um, the 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 again, the function of art. It seems like there are multiple functions of art. There are functions for society, and artists have social roles. There are functions of art that are deeply personal, that have psychological uh, utility to individuals. Um, there's the one way in which I can think of AI being more tool-like is it's almost like a prosthesis for your imagination, as it were. Certainly, maybe a speed up, like a turbocharging. Um, uh, if you've I don't know what everybody else's experience is with art and music. Just speaking from personal experience, I know that I've enjoyed the process not just of trying to take something that I can see in my mind's eye, that I can visualize with whatever neural processes are going on inside my my own brain, and trying to sort of crudely and painstakingly translate those out into a reality, external physical world. But there's not just that. There's more to art and expression than that. There's also a process of discovery, right? So if you've ever composed a piece of music or painted a painting or written something, um, you'll probably it probably is familiar to you that as you incrementally externalize these pieces of what you can sort of visualize in your mind, see in your mind's eye, you discover more and more about that process, and it is iterative. It is back and forth, and so I can imagine that artists would, and that perhaps people in general would be concerned about the loss of what that process um, uh, the loss of that process and what value it brings. This sort of iterative process of discovery that one has when one tries to do that.
Let me push back on that then. Well, that's an experience that maybe is limited to relatively few people, right? Relatively few people are artists or engage with art in that creative mode. Who's to say that these tools won't actually radically expand the number of people who get to enjoy that kind of process? Okay, so you take my son, for example. He can draw stick figures and color things in, and he likes to watch me draw and copies me. But it's a radically different experience for him. I mean, suppose the next generation of Dolly is you put on your VR headset and you're in the world and you just start speaking to the thing, and out of the fog emerge, shapes and colors and storylines and landscapes. What kind of ideas? I mean, he could go in there and start talking about the last YouTube video he saw about, asteroids hitting the Earth, or ant colonies. He loves ants because he watched some Kurzgesagt video about ant empires fighting each other. And he can talk about that, and he can see it come up, and he can fine-tune it and have this kind of interactive experience where he's shaping something beautiful and interesting out of his experience. That's something that artists get to feel, but only those who are... I mean, it takes some amount of skill and training to really feel deeply that that's a meaningful process. And a very tiny percentage of people get to do it. What if 95% of people could do it? Isn't that a better world?
Yeah, I find that very compelling. I have another question for you guys, which is
oh, sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I want to.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I want Matt to fight back. He's sticking out his tongue. Okay, coward. Go on, Adam. Oh, he's unmuting. Okay.
Can you hear me? Great. Yeah, I don't know if I said I don't find it, because Adam said he finds it very compelling. So I don't find it very compelling, but I don't think I have equally a very compelling counter argument. But it would be something like, there are people who seem to think that there's like no shortcut to virtue. So what if part of developing the discipline and the skill of like the skill that it takes to be an accomplished artist, I'm not accomplished, I mean like when you get to the point where you have developed a skill that you can kind of competently express what you want to express, that takes effort at the moment, and I'm not immediately compelled by the suggestion that just removing the effort requirement is going to be instantly better, because I think part of the sort of discipline development of that skill was something that was useful for the humans that were the select few who chose to develop themselves into artists. So that's my counterpoint.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, except one has to be very careful to find the locus of the discipline there. So I think when people transition from oil painting to, say, acrylics or some other easier form of art, I mean, many people would have decried, mixing your own egg yolks and finding your own ochres and so on is an essential part of oil painting, and you're just skipping that, and now, that's why your paintings are less deep. Or you could argue that hiking is a much better way to know a place than flying over it or getting some other form of interacting with it. I think all that, there's some virtue to that, but maybe what you really mean is you think you get some insight and depth out of discipline in the abstract, and then maybe you don't find any particular attachment to the content of the discipline in each particular case. I mean, I agree with that. I think, whatever form this imaginative exploration takes, you could refine it and get deeper and develop a kind of tool set there and master that tool set, and hopefully there will be things like that. But do you really think that the absence of that is in some way like I don't find much deep meaning in any. I mean, I used to paint quite a bit, and I'm familiar with the technical kind of things that go into that. And I assume it's the same with practicing to play an instrument. There's a lot of discipline and kind of tedious physical manipulation that goes into that, and that's part of forming the attachment to the art. I get it, but are you really saying that like that's the core of it, and that it can't somehow?
No, it's the discipline, like you said. So it's like the virtue that you develop through that process. And so, I guess I agree with you. And my point is that we need to make sure that you radically increase access to this expression ability, but at the same time you continue to give people an incentive to, like, I don't know how to put it, just like become virtuous, like to grow as people and that kind of all that stuff. And it's not just that. It's not about this particular activity of practicing art, but it's about the fact that was providing a method for, like, a pathway for people to grow as humans. And so you need to make sure there's a pathway if you're kind of removing this as a thing. And I'm not saying that there won't be. That's just why I wasn't very compelled.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? I mean, the value of discipline and the idea of, what is discipline? I suppose it's a number of different things. One thing that comes to my mind is that it is the willingness to make a sacrifice in the present in service of a longer term goal. And so discipline involves willingness to incur cost. It involves other things that we see as virtuous, like patience and dedication, which again are sort of, I don't mean to reduce things to economic.
Uh-oh. Can't hear you, Adam.
Oh, shoot. Sorry. What happened to my audio there?
You're back.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Where did I drop off somewhere? Where did I leave off?
Can't reduce something to...
Oh, so I don't mean to say that, I don't mean to reduce all of this into merely, economic costs, or even, a more broadly fungible notion of utility. But discipline, at least in some sense, is relational, right? It's relative. It is the exercise of parsing a finite amount of time and attention and other resources that you have control over, in a structured way. And if and I suppose a lot of this is wrapped up in our physical experience. Are you willing to incur pain and discomfort in order to achieve a goal, in order to are you willing to put 10,000 hours of not so fun practice into an instrument in order to get good enough so that you can then be fully expressive in a skillful way with it? Maybe exercise itself like physical exercise is a good example, right? I mean, if you could take a pill that just turned you into an Olympic level of fitness, as opposed to having to actually go to the gym and have a careful diet, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? Well, you could certainly make the argument on some levels of analysis that the world would be a better place if everybody was physically fit, everybody was capable, everybody could do all kinds of activities whenever they wished, without the obstacle of having to get in really good shape or train for them. It would be great if obesity and type 2 diabetes and all the other health complications of overnutrition, of overeating, were not there. If we were simply our ideal physiological cells, even just as we currently conceive our biology, never mind like enhancing ourselves or whatever, which presumably we will do later this century. But my point is that there's a lot to unpack there in terms of what discipline means, both in concrete terms, in whatever context you're talking about, and then, as Dan said, also as an abstract idea. And as an abstract idea, it seems to me that's mostly relational. It's about what you're willing to trade-offs you're willing to make. and costs and pain and suffering and disutility are willing to occur in the near term in order to obtain some greater return on that investment later on, or over some longer unit of time, right? Over some longer time horizon. And the tools allow us to shortcut the trades that our evolved biology imposes on us, right? So we simply live within these trade-offs that we have to make, because that's what evolution molded us into. But then we invent new tools, and those boundaries disappear. And then the question is, well, should we have to continue to make painful trade-off decisions? And what is the sort of the utility of that, or the value of that in the more abstract sense? And I think that's a super important question. It's easy to imagine. I'm sure there are sci-fi, stories and whatnot about it, about the fulfillment, the realization of that ancient Persian curse, right? The very famous one: "May your every wish be instantly granted." This is a very famous curse, right? And because then nothing in relative terms, nothing has any satisfaction, because there's no sacrifice required for it. And so, I think this is we're now getting to the point where we're having to talk about some of the downsides of an abundant world, or a world of abundance. And for the longest time, these were silly. These were philosophical, and it was just fantastical to even consider them seriously. Well, hey, now we're starting. This is starting to become real. Shit's getting real. Energy's going to be super abundant. Intelligence and creativity are going to be super abundant. Food is already super abundant. That's come with problems. I mean, holy moly. What was once just a philosophical thought experiment, well, now we really have to grapple with this for reals.
Yeah, I mean, to have this whole conversation, I've sort of felt like we can't get very far without, like, things are coming down to a disagreement between, like, what's actually valuable, and that seems like a pretty deep question that we haven't really talked about yet.
I guess if we focus on merely, what things will be destabilized, that's maybe a little bit independent of value. So that's kind of why I wanted to focus on that, but I agree with drifting a bit from that.
I think you're right. I think it's like, I think that's good. That's a good point. We can separate, for example, the fact that artists will be displaced, the labor that they currently, like that relationship they currently have, like the one you drew on the board, between artists' art and society, whether or not the AI created stuff is art, which is maybe like a more philosophical question that will take you into discussing value. Whether or not that's the case, the relationship seems set to be disrupted. I think we can agree on that.
Yeah, maybe we should get back to that when Adam returns. Oh, the world's full of water, which has stopped him going in the pipe. That's my bad.
Oh, no. So, where did that come from?
Oh, it's one of these random things.
Greenhouse gas emissions 30 years ago?
That's right, yeah. It's a rogue AI started making water out of ice.
He's scaling the mountain.
Yeah, that's right. Well, originally there was water in that mountain, sort of, I don't know if you know the one I'm talking about, that has that floating orb in it. There used to be water coming out of that. That was the idea, that it would fill up the world. Hello?
Okay, there we go. Now I can hear you guys again.
Yeah,
sorry about that.
I made your return journey harder than it had to be. Sorry.
I don't know how to dive down without my mouse. I don't have a mouse right now, so sorry, I'm lame.
Matt, we were just discussing while you were gone, and I think we should, in the last 10 minutes or so, try and get back away from these normative discussions about what is art and what is good or bad about what's going to happen, and back to what will be disrupted by it or undermined by it. So Yeah, on that note, let me pick up on the Persian curse a little bit. So you could say that maybe it will encourage people to have this vibrant art around them all the time, but it might also be deeply discouraging. So I've mentioned, I think, to a few of you, I was quite moved by Lee Sedol's experience with AlphaGo, not only at the time, but then 2 years later when he retired. So when Lee Sedol retired from Go, maybe he's back now, I think, but he retired and he said, I played Go because not only did I want to be the best in the world, but I wanted to come up with new ideas and show the world something beautiful and new that nobody had ever seen before. And I wanted to do that at the pinnacle of human competence. And maybe I'm still, this is now me paraphrasing, that was roughly speaking what he said. And my interpretation of that is something like, well, okay, maybe I'm still the pinnacle of human competence, but I'm not the pinnacle of competence. And I'm, maybe now no longer motivated to create in light of something else which is also creative, and at least I feel like it's going to be better than me. Now, you could say he's wrong and that human Go will always have some quality that's missing from machines, etc., but okay, he did retire and he did say that, and that's a fact. And I think, when it comes to creative activity, well, when you're sketching on your own, it doesn't matter that Da Vinci would always be better than you, but maybe it's important that Da Vinci isn't in your living room sketching, or just that you could summon him at will. So maybe one of the effects of widespread cheap intelligence, creative or otherwise, will be a kind of discouraging. Some people will be deeply encouraged by that, and maybe other people will be deeply discouraged, and this divide might be quite significant.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was thinking. I was just wondering if. So right now, we have a sense of possession, of ownership of our own intelligence and our skills. But in some sense, this is an illusion. This goes back to very, very old debates about free will and so on. But there's a sense in which, we feel a oh, God, rats! I'm crashing again. Darn. Wait, can you guys still hear me?
Yep.
Ooh, maybe if I don't click the OK button, I can't move, but we can still have the conversation. I've got the unexpected error.
Okay.
We need to quit.
Keep going.
But I'm not going to click anything. I'll just keep going. Because you said you heard me say rats, and okay, so I figured. All right. So sorry. Let me cut quickly to the chase. I can imagine a time in the future when the capacities that we've developed with AI don't feel like they're out there, but they feel like they're in here. They feel like they're just part of our own mind. It's sort of a much more in a sci-fi sense, like a cybernetic enhancement. This is just a capacity. I now own it. It's part of me. It's internal to me. I'm just, my abilities have been expanded thanks to these tools. And I think many tools are like that. Perhaps, there's a time when you're smashing something with your fist or a rock in your hand, and there's a hammer across the room and it's in use, and you're thinking, man, that would be an amazing capacity to possess. And maybe you could speak across the room and say, hey, could you take that hammer and do something with it, please? And whoever the wielder of it does the task, and it feels outside of yourself and you don't feel full ownership of it. But then once you get it in your hand, it just feels like an extension of your will. And I'm wondering if and when these capacities that we're seeing, now in rapid development, whether if and how quickly they will come to feel like just extensions of our own will. And whether because you mentioned, we stand in relation to Da Vinci, that can be intimidating or alienating, maybe. But, if Da Vinci is just another module somewhere in your neocortex, well, isn't that just you?
Can you hear us, Adam?
Right.
I can still hear you guys, but I can't mute myself. So
That's
I'll
fine.
just
Amazing.
leave my mic on.
You've also disappeared from the world. Your character is no longer here.
Okay, the ghost of Dr. Disruption remains.
Yeah.
Speaking of embodiments of tool of
Yeah, you're in our minds now, Adam. You're a capability.
all right, there you go. I'm now the voice in your head. This is your conscience speaking,
That's
Daniel.
right. Yeah. Yeah, I guess that also gets at another deeply disabling thing, I think, which is people's sense of uniqueness, which is very easily, I mean, people are not unique, generally speaking, right? I mean, we have unique experiences, but we tend to think about our reactions and opinions as being much more sort of distinct than they really are.
Right.
And it's very uncomfortable for people to realize that they're just kind of Joe Blow, and that everything they say or think is more or less average and can be predicted pretty easily. I'm not, I sound like a terrible elitist right now. I'm not counting myself out of that. In the aggregate, humans, we behave pretty predictably most of the time, and our experiences are all pretty generic. But we're sort of protected from thinking about that very much. It's like a blind spot that we need to maintain in order to feel that we have some value in the world. And of course we do have value to the people around us and so on, but we often feel like we have some, to feel like the protagonist in our own story, we kind of need to feel like a hero or some kind of unique character, right? Now, if everybody has, Da Vinci Module 3.0 in their head, and everybody has Da Vinci Module 3.0, that'll start to undermine that sense of uniqueness, especially when you've got many other modules like that. But that's also something that I think is going to be one of these undermining factors is, people will be confronted all the time with, if GPT-3 can write an essay that you could have written, and when it looks at your other output, more or less comes to sound like you and can reply to your emails more or less like you, well, that's pretty much, there's something very confronting psychologically about that, I think, which maybe right now people don't really feel, but they could come to feel as they rely more on these kinds of technologies or are forced to rely on them in order to stay competitive in various ways. So yeah, maybe that's another topic for later.
Yeah, I have a reply to this, Dan. I think you're broadly right about, I broadly agree with what you're saying about how this will make people feel, but I guess I want to push back on the notion that people are, so maybe you've presented like people are valuable to the people around them. People want to think that they're kind of some kind of hero. They're like globally valuable. I would say that probably there's like an in-between stance that I have, which is that people are not just valuable to the people around them, even if they are not globally unique and like irreplaceable. So what I think is that someone could be replaceable in like a situation. Like if I was at a job and then someone fired me and hired someone else, they could do the job pretty much just as well. And then in that sense, it like didn't matter that I was there. The world, like I've not affected the world. But you could be replaceable in almost any situation, but it could still be important that you exist and have your unique experiences. And so in a sense, like not be replaceable in aggregate. So what I mean is like, if you imagine taking all the people in the world and replacing them with some much smaller group of homogenous people with homogenous experiences, that world would collapse. So the diversity of experiences, I think, is like a very important part of how humanity gets by. It's kind of like some noise in the optimization process that culture is going through, and that like enforces independence, and then the ensemble performs better than the individuals. Or I guess I'm just like imagining these sort of statistics inspired analogies. Because no one in the world, I am unique compared to anyone in the world, because like Dan said, no one else has had my exact life. And it's not important that my exact life was the way it was, but it's important that it was different and that everyone has a different life. That introduces a useful that adds a useful value to the system as a whole.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think it's not a question of whether it's really true that people's value is tied to their uniqueness, but I think people do feel that way, which is like where midlife crises and so on come from. It's sort of like, okay, I thought I was going to be a worldwide hero and Alexander the Great, and here I am, and I'm just a good father and a good husband and a member of my community, which is of course plenty and really great, right? But people do feel a bit disappointed with that. And I think that sense of non-uniqueness, if it's forced upon them much earlier and much more obviously and more often, will be, I think it may be a source of maturity for people to just get that and get over it, but I think it may be one of these things that people find confronting. I guess Adam's,
I think we.
Oh, you're still there. You're not even showing up on the user list.
No,
anymore.
I'm still here. I'm listening. No, I'm here.
Go on.
No, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be here. I'm never going to close this window, and I'll just be here when you guys log back in next week. I was going to just add one quick thought, which is that, like so many of these say, like this point I'm going to make has come up in the past in these conversations, which is that it is always a temptation to indulge this, what I've called, in my own work, the Ceteris Paribus fallacy, this idea that all else is equal. It's always a temptation to think that way, to think, okay, well, I'm just going to look at this one variable, see how it changes, control everything else. Everything else is constant. Of course, the real world isn't like that. And so I think one thing that one manifestation of that idea in this conversation, in this context of what we're talking about here, is that if we avail ourselves of these incredible new tools, whether we do so, sort of at arm's length, or whether we fully internalize them, both of those different scenarios we've kind of talked through a little bit. A whole lot else in the world is going to be changing at the same time. Those aren't the only things that are going to be changing, obviously. Okay, and it's tough to think about everything and everything varying all at once. One other thing that comes to my mind here is that these new tools themselves will open up the possibility for thinking very differently, and I think in a much more open-ended way, about our own values and goals and aspirations. And so in other words, as we become more capable, thanks to these, to AI, and I mean into both at the individual unit of analysis and then at more larger group levels, as we become more capable, I think what we aim to achieve, what we aspire to, what our goals are, I think it's reasonable to expect that those will evolve as well, that those will change. This is sort of the aspiration of education in general, right? I mean, if we were in our state of nature, if we were just cavemen from our ancestral environment, our goals would be very primitive. They'd be quite brutish, and barbarous by our sort of modern lights. Okay, fine. And one of the things that we hope to achieve with education, at least perhaps in the classical sense, I'm sorry if this is a little politically incorrect these days, but one of the things we hope to achieve is some sort of level of refinement, some sort of achievement of personal growth and development that then allows us to appreciate not better things or different things, but just more, to be more appreciative, to see more in the world, to understand more, and then to extract more meaning from it. And just the education and the growth that has unlocked in humanity so far, both at the individual level of analysis and group levels of analysis, is amazing and beautiful and extraordinary. And in some way, the expansion of our capacities with AI and other tools is just an extension of what we're already doing with something like education, which is pushing our capacities, pushing away the boundaries and the limits and expanding our capacities. And what has always come along with that, or at least I think I think what has come along with that is the growth of our values and goals and sources of meaning and sense of purpose and so forth. And so I would hope that that would continue. Now, maybe that's not realistic, maybe that's naive, but I certainly remain optimistic that if we make ourselves smarter with these tools, we're going to see much more about our world and about its possibilities, and we will have all sorts of new things to aspire to and find meaning in. So, but again, I guess that's more of an intuition than anything evidence based. But
amen to that.
I'm optimistic by nature, so yeah.
I think we'll have to wrap up. Yeah, but this is let's continue next week.
Okay, awesome.
Thanks, Adam.
I'll be here.
Yeah.
All right, take care, guys.
Not creepy at all. See ya.